so should be good.
Okay, and you are now the host.
All right, let me just look at something. Okay, I just need, before, just in case you go anywhere, for you to remind me how to turn it over to the next person.
Okay, if you get up the participant, if you get up the participant screen,
Get out of it or get into it?
get into it,
Yeah,
and hover over the camera, choose someone's name and hover over the camera, video camera next to them. You should get a drop-down menu.
Oh, okay, I see. I was hovering over me, so I have to go to the person that I want to make the host and go to, got it. All right, we're in business.
You are in business.
All right, well, hi, everybody. Joanna, I don't know if you want to start.
Yes, sure. Well, it's absolutely wonderful to see everyone. Thanks very much, Abigail, for this exceptionally intriguing and fascinating hour. And it's really good to be able to actually see people and talk like we haven't been able to do before. So that was quite a lovely idea that you had, Jennifer, to call our little slot Tea and Tales. So I don't know, I've got my cup of tea.
I've got my cup that actually has water in it, but we can pretend that it's tea.
So I was thinking of saying, oh, come and take tea with us. But then I thought, hang on a minute, no, I can't say that because Beau Brummel said we're not supposed to. That there was some anecdote that this lady invited him to take tea at her house. And he said, madam, you can take a walk, you can take a medicine, you can take a liberty, but you can only drink tea. So let's drink a cup of tea. And if you would like to take a liberty and ask us anything, then we'll try to answer, think on our feet and answer. And in the meantime, Jennifer and I were going to start off by reading a couple of pages from well, from the last book that went out. And Jennifer, from something that I've been looking forward to for quite some time, because it's I don't know how much of it you want to tell us. So I'm not going to jump the gun and say anything, but it's a fascinating premise. I think it's one of the most I don't know, most enjoyed in Jeff. So I'm really looking forward to hear the excerpt. Would you like to start?
How do you want to do it? Do you want me to go first?
Whichever way you'd like to go.
Why don't you read first?
Okay.
And then I'll talk and I'll read.
Right. So at some point this week, I'm actually going to get the paperback out as well. It still has the do not for resale, and at least it's not going all over Darcy's eyes and making him look like he's in front of a firing squad. But I don't know if anyone's familiar with the premise. I thought I'd spin the story off in the middle of that absolutely horrible proposal. I mean, I don't know how. Yes, I suppose in some ways this brings me back to what Abigail was saying earlier, that we read the book, but then we get to be inspired by all sorts of secondary sources. And I have to say that I'm exceptionally curious what had actually happened in that proposal, because Jane Austen doesn't tell us, and it's like a great shame that she doesn't. But I have to say, I thought that Andrew Davies did a wonderful job in making him bury himself in just 1 minute flat. It's less than 1 minute, and during that time, just completely manages to blast all his chances out of the water. So I thought it would be good to stop him from doing that. And imagine a scenario where he doesn't get to tell her that she's beneath him, he's doing her a favor for marrying her and everything else, and just leave it at I ardently admire and love you. So I don't know if you're familiar with the premise. Colin Fitzwilliam comes in and to lets them know that Anne has eloped with Wickham. Mr. Collins turns out to be in the doghouse because Lady Catherine blames him for bringing Wickham back to Anne's attention. So Lady Catherine is asking Elizabeth to be her minion on the way to London. And because Elizabeth would very much like to finish off the conversation with Darcy and let him know that no, thank you very much, it's not going to happen, I'm not going to marry you, she accepts. So she's off to Rosings to start on her journey. The preparations and the short journey to Rosings took no time at all. As the small, unprepossessing vehicle sent to collect her rounded the last bend in the road and rushed through the imposing gateway, Elizabeth caught her first glimpse of the hustle and bustle at the entrance. The elegant drive that wound in a wide circle before the portico facade now bore a stark resemblance to the courtyard of a busy hostelry. A large barouche was waiting, with a coachman, footman, and postilions at the ready. Servants were scurrying to and fro, one with an armful of carriage rugs and cushions, another with a wicker basket, and 6 more with an assortment of trunks and cases, which they proceeded to secure at the back of the conveyance under the butler's supervision. The harnessed horses stomped and snorted, and beyond them 2 saddle mounts were barely held in check by a pair of grooms, while a nervous-looking lad sought to strap a set of saddlebags in place without being trampled. The gig drew to a halt behind Lady Catherine's barouche, and Elizabeth stepped out without waiting for assistance. It would have been long in coming anyway. The man who had brought her there took his time in leaving his seat, then hesitantly offered, "Mayhap you'd care to make your way with him, ma'am, or sit yourself in Lady Catherine's carriage till her ladyship is ready to depart." Elizabeth's lips quirked in wry amusement at this indication of the sort of treatment she should expect in Lady Catherine's sphere, and not only from the great lady herself. Wait in the carriage, indeed. Whatever next? Was she perchance expected to carry her own trunk to the barouche as well? A fresh burst of activity at the entrance drew her from the arch reflections. A footman emerged, carrying a second pair of saddlebags. Hard on his heels were Colonel Fitzwilliam and Mr. Darcy. "Miss Bennet!" exclaimed the latter. He gestured the others to continue on their way, but for his part, he changed course and hastened down the stone steps towards her. "What brings you here?" he swiftly asked. "Not further trouble, I hope." Despite herself, Elizabeth gave a quiet snort as she waited for him to join her. Trouble? It was both fitting and ironic that he should speak of further trouble, since that was the main reason she was there, about to embark on an unplanned journey. The vast amount of trouble he stood to cause her with his abrupt offer and his declared intention to follow her to Longbourn. Sadly, at this point in time, she could not speak of it and seek to prevent it. Not on Lady Catherine's doorstep and with a host of servants milling about. So Elizabeth merely said, "No, just your aunt's request. She wishes me to escort her to town." "And you would comply?" Why he should be displeased at her compliance, Elizabeth could not begin to fathom, unless he took objection to yet another interruption, for he aimed his scowl at Lady Catherine's butler as the man approached with a half bow and a very formal, "Good evening, ma'am. Just in time, if I may say so. Lady Catherine wishes to be gone at 15 minutes to the hour. Her ladyship bids you to wait in the great hall. If you would follow me. Oh, and Joana, be sure to strap the young lady's trunk to her ladyship's carriage." Well, at least they had established was to move the trunk, Elizabeth airedly thought. But a moment later, the groom was forestalled. "Leave that for now, Joana. I thank you, Ormerod. You may return to your duties." Mr. Darcy spoke with much less ceremony and nothing of the old butler's sedateness. Then, without so much as a "by your leave," he took possession of her elbow and steered her away from the 2 men and the rest of a swarming crowd. His presumption could not fail to antagonize her. So he already imagined that he could direct her every move. Of course, the misguided soul who would accept his offer of marriage would be expected to obey him without demur, just as Omrod and Joana had. It would not do to make a scene, so Elizabeth did not. Nevertheless, she bristled. "Your cousin is waiting," she pointed out. "I thought you were about to set off." "We are," came Mr. Darcy's terse agreement, "but I would speak with you, and I with you, but this is not the time." "No, a pity. Still, this scheme of my aunt's, I must say that I do not like it. I would strongly suggest you make your excuses and return to Hunsford." Elizabeth arched a brow. He was charmed, personified, and no mistake. Heaven forbid that she should wander into Lord Malvern's hallowed halls tonight, and let it slip that he aimed to align himself with a little nobody from Hertfordshire. "You need not harbour any concerns on that score," she said crisply. "In fact, I do." He cut her off, in blatant disregard for the most basic requirements of civility. "My aunt is not at her most congenial at the moment. I fear she will make for a demanding and irascible companion, and I would much rather she did not vent her ire on you. Not while I'm not there to deflect it." Oh, that was unexpected. He had scarce given himself the trouble to deflect her ladyship's unmannerly remarks before. The startling change of stance surprised her into a nervous little chuckle. So Lady Catherine was not congenial at the moment. Was she ever? Well, at least now she had good reason to be as unpleasant as she chose. "She's a distraught mother," Elizabeth saw fit to share the charitable reflection with Mr. Darcy, her voice and manner softened by an inborn sense of justice, which prompted her to make some amends for suspecting him of self-absorbed and prideful motives. "For the same reason," she continued, "I shall not take it to heart, whatever her ladyship might choose to say or do today. I flatter myself that I can weather it." All of a sudden, his mien warmed into a disarmingly open smile. "If anyone can, that would be you," he said, distracting her from the unprofitable exercise of warily staring at the novel turn of his countenance that altered his expression almost beyond recognition. By the looks of it, the dour Mr. Darcy could sport a smile if fancy took him. Astonishing. Until now, he had given no evidence of it. But that was neither here nor there. He must have smiled in unholy satisfaction when he had persuaded spineless Mr. Bingley that he could do better than Jane. Elizabeth glanced away as she welcomed the reminder of his unpardonable interference. It was a very good defence against the recollection of the feel of his lips pressed to the palm of her hand. Inopportune and treacherous, that bothersome memory had resurfaced a few moments ago, when Mr. Darcy's hand had slipped from her elbow to close around her fingers, and his thumb had begun to brush back and forth over her knuckles. She could still sense the light caress despite the double barrier of gloves, and it might have occurred her to wonder why she had not withdrawn her hand as yet, had he not distracted her further with a softly spoken, "Thank you. You are generous and kind, as always. My aunt might not be able to show due appreciation, not today, but I am very grateful for your patience with her. Your company will be a comfort, and it will be very good to see you sooner than I might have expected." Briefly, the clasp of his fingers tightened as he whispered, "Safe travels, and I hope your journey is not overly taxing." Elizabeth did withdraw her hand at last, but thought it only proper to say, "And yours likewise. God willing, you will find Mr. Berg before too long and keep her safe." Mr. Darcy nodded, and his air grew sombre as he spoke again. "This reminds me, I must appeal once more to your kindness and ask you to keep my disclosures about Georgiana's error to yourself." Her shoulders stiff, Elizabeth tossed her head back. "You may be assured of my secrecy," she retorted, rather offended that he should think her prone to gossip. "I would not jeopardize anyone's good name with careless talk. No, of course not. I was speaking of keeping that information from my aunt and the rest of my family." Her eyes widened. "They do not know?" "None of them knows except Fitzwilliam. We are very close, and I trust him without question, even if he can be alarmingly hot-headed under severe provocation, as you might have gathered from his outburst at the parsonage. But as for the others, it would be best for Georgiana if they remained in ignorance." "I understand. They will not hear it from me," Elizabeth replied without hesitation, and saw his tense countenance smoothing into relief. Mr. Darcy clasped the hand again, in silent thanks, no doubt, then bid his farewells and hastened on his way. The solemn promise was easily made, and it would be easily kept, Elizabeth determined, as she watched him weave across the busy drive. Of course, she would not breathe a word of the sad business. She would not endanger anyone's good name, just as she has already told him. Besides, she of all people could see the need of keeping damaging disclosures from one's meddlesome relations. Miss Darcy's secret would be safe with her. But the fact that he had chosen to trust her with it, trust her without question after a short and fraught acquaintance, was as astounding as it was illogical. A man who, by his own admission, prided himself on his superiority of mind, should have paid more heed to the dictates of logic. Likewise, a sensible young woman should know better than to ponder on confounding gentlemen and their irrational choices. Vexingly, it was easier said than done. I'm sorry that, unlike Stevie Zimmerman, I can't do voices. But the good news is that Stevie Zimmerman can do voices, and she's narrating this as we speak. So I'm sure she'll do an awful lot better than me. So Jennifer, if you'd like to.
Yeah, that was great. Loved it. So for those of you who haven't read Joanna's latest book, I have. It's excellent, as all her books are. I would say it's a little less angsty than some of the other ones, but I think, Joanna, what you do so well is just the romantic moments between Darcy and Elizabeth. And there are some real swoon-worthy ones in this book as well towards the end. I just hope, like, hanging out with these authors, you know, that it's going to rub off on me somehow by osmosis, because
your To Conquer Pride was absolutely fantastic. So you don't need any rubbing of any sort. But,
I don't know. I beg to differ. But so for those of you who don't know me, as Abigail mentioned, I am definitely one of the newer Author Variations authors, and just a new author to Jaff in general. So I have been reading Jaff probably not that long, but maybe 6 or 7 years. And I started writing my first Pride and Prejudice variation in, I guess it was about 2015. It took me 3 years to finish it from beginning to end. And I published it in November of 2018. So it's coming up on, it's a little over a year and a half. So my goal is to have my next book out, let's just say by the end of the year for sure. Fingers crossed, maybe it'll be more like early fall, early autumn, but it's a work in progress. I would say I'm about 80 to 85% through the first draft. So, so this is my first, in case anyone hasn't maybe seen my face, you can associate me with this book. This is To Conquer Pride, which is my debut. So the book what I'm going to read to you from today is my work in progress. So Joanna kind of touched on it. So I tend to, as I think all authors do, I like to write what I like to read. So when I first contemplated the idea of writing a Pride and Prejudice variation, I sort of tapped into what I like when I read them, which is really a lot of Darcy and Elizabeth together time. I tend to get frustrated with books where they are separated for a good portion of the story. I just really want a lot of interaction between those two characters, whether they're fighting or whether it's, you know, whatever it is. I just kind of want them in the same space interacting with each other. So To Conquer Pride, I sort of put them in a carriage accident and stranded them in a snowstorm for a few days in a cottage, which is one of my favorite tropes when it comes to Pride and Prejudice variations. And then for the second book that I'm working on now, I sort of went to my second favorite trope, which is the forced marriage scenario. So Joanna actually coined this phrase. I don't know if you coined it or if you heard it somewhere, but Joanna called it an early marriage scenario. So did you make that up, or?
Well, I sort of try to come up with something that doesn't include forced in it, because it's consensual, just not ideal.
Yeah. So I'm sort of calling it an early marriage scenario simply because there's really no force in it in terms of, usually when you read a forced marriage scenario, there's something at work forcing the two of them to marry. Usually either Elizabeth's compromised or Mr. Bennet has died and she needs to marry Darcy for his wealth. There's some reason that forces the two of them together. And in my book, that really isn't the case. Darcy proposes of his own free will and Elizabeth accepts of her own free will. There are factors, of course, that come into play as to why he proposes and why she accepts, but they both go into it willingly and not because they're forced into it in any way. However, the same thing applies that usually does in a forced marriage scenario, which is that they sort of fall in love with each other after marriage. And I think the reason that I really love that trope, and I think the reason that a lot of other people love it too, is it puts them in the same space for the entirety of the book. With the Regency era, it's kind of hard to have a single gentleman and a single lady alone together, for long periods of time. And, so I think a forced marriage, they're together now and there's no issue with how or why they would be left alone together because they're married. And there's something to me about this coming to love each other, sort of by enforced proximity. So that is a little bit of backstory. So in terms of, I'm going to read from just the first scene of chapter 1. A few things before I start to read. As I said, this is definitely a work in progress as opposed to what Joanna read, which is a book that is out in the world. This is definitely a first draft, so keep that in mind. The second thing is that you will definitely be the very first people to hear any of this. I have not shared any of this book with anyone. No one has seen it, no one has read it, no one has heard it. I haven't shared it with a critique partner or another writer or a family member or anybody. So this is the very first time that I am sharing any part of this. So this is going to be the beginning, the first part of chapter 1. However, there probably will be a prologue that comes before this. Unfortunately, I am still writing that. Another thing that is maybe a little bit unique to me, I mean, I'm sure other writers, everyone has their own process, but I personally write out of order, which makes it a little bit interesting and unique when you're trying to revise the book and sort of stitching all these scenes together like Frankenstein's monster sometimes. So I actually started writing the prologue. I wrote like 2 paragraphs and then I skipped to something else. So it hasn't been finished, which is why I'm not going to start with that today. But I think chapter 1 will give you a little bit of a sense. So as I kind of alluded to, both Darcy and Elizabeth go into the marriage for their own reasons. So we're going to see Darcy's reason a little bit in this beginning scene. Just to kind of jump ahead a little bit, when Darcy does propose, the interesting thing, the way that I set it up is that he's not quite as, it's not quite as terrible as a proposal as in canon, in that he doesn't insult her family. I kind of felt like I couldn't have that because there would be no way she would accept him. So he thinks better of that and is a little bit nicer, but on the other hand, he does not tell her that he loves her. He does not declare that he ardently admires and loves her in his proposal, because he really kind of doesn't in my book. I mean, I think he's, as in canon, infatuated with her and certainly drawn to her, but maybe not in love with her. And maybe he doesn't even, I don't think, realize that he's in love with her until, later in the book when they're married. Okay, so again, keep in mind that this is a work in progress, and it is, I'm sure it will go through a lot more polishing in revisions, but this is what we've got right now. Okay, start with the drink. Okay, Darcy bowed to his partner as the final strains of the quadrille faded into the autumn air. Elizabeth offered him a slight curtsy and an arch smile, and they parted in silence. she walking in the direction of her friend, Miss Lucas, and Darcy drifting to a corner of Netherfield's candlelit ballroom, his mind churning. How could the dance that he had looked forward to all evening, nay, for a fortnight at least, if he were honest with himself, have gone so horribly wrong, that she would take Wickham's part and paint him as the villain, if she only knew the truth of the matter? Not that she ever would. To enlighten her would be to put his sister's reputation in jeopardy, and he would take no chances where Georgiana was concerned. He and Elizabeth had not been separated for long when Darcy became aware of a tall, heavy-looking fellow dressed in an ill-fitting suit advancing in his direction at a rapid pace. Narrowing his gaze, Darcy realized it was the bumbling oaf who had danced the first set with Miss Elizabeth. Turning away, he scanned the room for some means of escape, but a moment later, the man drew to a halt before him, bending low at the waist in a solemn bow. Mr. Darcy, if I may say so, I have made a remarkable discovery. It has just been brought to my attention that you are the nephew of Lady Catherine de Bourgh of Rosings Park. The man continued to speak, but Darcy could scarcely attend to what he was saying. Good God, was this ridiculous person attempting his own introduction? Darcy could only stare back in total disbelief, and it was a full 2 minutes before the words apology and Hunsford penetrated his consciousness, and another moment before he realized that the man who stood before him must be his aunt's new rector. What is your name, sir? Darcy interrupted at the first opportunity. Ah, but I should have said so already. Pray forgive me. My name is Collins, sir, William Collins. Darcy nodded, and the man continued to speak, assuring him of Lady Catherine's good health and beginning to detail his recent arrival into the neighborhood. Barely suppressing a groan, Darcy offered the clergyman a shallow bow and was on the cusp of making his excuses when something Collins said arrested his attention. I beg your pardon, did you say you were a relation of the Bennets? Darcy asked. Even at this slight degree of interest, the rector's face lit with delight. Indeed, sir, Mr. Bennet is my cousin, and though I do not like to speak of such things, the Longbourn estate is in fact entailed upon me. Darcy startled slightly at this bit of intelligence, but before he could open his mouth to reply, Collins rushed on. Oh, but I can see what you are thinking. You are worried for my young cousins. Of course you are. Such feelings do you the greatest credit, although I would expect nothing less from the esteemed nephew of Lady Catherine de Bourgh. But it is now my privilege to inform you that I am very sensible to the hardship and uncertainty that my fair cousins have been forced to endure. Furthermore, you will be relieved to know that I have entered the neighborhood with the sole purpose of healing the breach between our two families and securing the futures of all my dear cousins through the joys of matrimony. Darcy could only stare, attempting to parse any relevant information from the man's rambling speech. Are you telling me that you were betrothed to one of the Bennet daughters? He finally asked incredulously. Turning red about the ears, Collins began to stammer a reply. Well, that is, I must own that the precise details have not yet been firmly fixed. However, I have determined to make my formal addresses on the morrow, and I have every reason to expect a favorable response. Indeed, my dear cousin Elizabeth and I have but one mind and one way of thinking. We seem to have been designed for one another. At Collins' words, Darcy physically recoiled, and the breath seemed to leave his body. You intend to marry Miss Elizabeth? Collins beamed back at him. Am I not the most fortunate of men? My dear cousin is uniformly charming. From almost the first moment of my arrival, I singled her out as the companion of my future life, and I am assured by her honored mother that my suit will be most welcome. Indeed, if you call tomorrow, I am certain you will have occasion to wish us joy. Darcy stiffened, his heart leaping into his throat. Elizabeth married to this man? It was insupportable. Luckily, he was saved from formulating a reply, as Collins was not silent for long. Ah, but I can see your concern, and I perfectly comprehend your feelings. You are naturally thinking of your aunt. Once again, I am in a position to put your mind at ease. Rest assured, Lady Catherine has sanctioned the match with the greatest degree of condescension. Twice she has given me her opinion on this subject. Indeed, it was right before I left Hunsford that she said, Mr. Collins, you must marry. A clergyman like you must marry. Choose properly, choose a gentlewoman for my sake. And when I wrote to her of my dearest cousin Elizabeth, she penned her reply with the greatest alacrity. Marry the girl, Mr. Collins, she said. Bring her to Hunsford as soon as may be, and I will visit her. Collins finally paused long enough to draw breath, and Darcy cut him off with the briefest of bows. You will excuse me. Turning on his heel, Darcy beat a hasty retreat, striding towards the grand staircase without a backwards glance. Reaching his rooms, he stalked across the threshold, shrugging out of his too-tight jacket and tossing it unceremoniously over the back of a nearby chair. Making his way to a decanter that sat on a low table, he poured himself a generous portion of brandy. He took a long swallow before pacing to the window and staring out at the lit torches that lined the gravel drive. It could not be true. Elizabeth Bennet, his Elizabeth, married to such a man? Of course, the clergyman had not yet offered for her, but clearly Collins had no doubt of receiving a positive response, and when he eventually made his addresses. Was such a thing possible? Darcy could anticipate Mrs. Bennet's endorsement of the match, but surely Elizabeth would not welcome her cousin's attentions. Darcy set down his glass with a bang before continuing to pace his chambers. He could not believe that she would go along with such a scheme. She was too intelligent, too lively and witty and bold to ever attach herself to such an oaf as her cousin. Still, Darcy had every reason to believe that she was an obedient daughter. He had witnessed her loyalty firsthand when she had walked 3 miles to Netherfield to nurse her sister Jane. If she would go to such lengths over a trifling cold, would she not do everything in her power to secure the future of her entire family, even if it meant sacrificing her own happiness? A sick feeling settled in the pit of Darcy's stomach. She would marry Collins. She would see it as her duty, and worse yet, she would go with him to live at Hunsford, where Darcy would be forced to witness her misery, or heaven forbid, her felicity, each and every spring when he visited his aunt's estate. No, he could not leave her to such a fate. Something must be done, and soon, as Collins intended to make his offer the next day. Sinking into a chair, Darcy rubbed his temples. Perhaps if he spoke to Mr. Bennet. But what incentive would that gentleman have to do as Darcy asked? Why should he not wish to see his favorite daughter married to the heir to his estate? Even if Darcy could convince him that such a match would not be in Elizabeth's best interest, understanding and agreeing were two different things. No, the only way Mr. Bennet might concede is if there were another offer on the table, a better offer, someone who is able to provide his second daughter with more than William Collins ever could. Darcy's head snapped up and he immediately sat straighter in his chair. No, it was impossible. He could never form such an attachment. It would be a degradation to the Darcy name. Her family was inferior to his own in every respect. Such an alliance went against all that he stood for. But you want her, a small voice whispered inside his head. Though it goes against your will, against your reason, and even against your character, you want her still. The hours that followed were some of the longest and most grueling of Darcy's life, but by the time the sun peeked over the horizon, he knew what must be done. And that's the beginning.
That's absolutely wonderful. I was melting when Collins turned up. So
I think that kind of gives you a little sense of like why he decides to go into the marriage, and then Elizabeth will have her own reasons for accepting. But then what comes next is just kind of them, you know, like I said, trying to figure each other out and learn to love each other as the book goes on.
I'm looking forward to it. So when are we likely to hold it in our little midst?
Oh, well, yeah, I mean, I was originally hoping the end of the summer, but as I'm not even finished with the first draft, it might be more like September, October, November. I don't know. Definitely, let's just say I really think before the end of the year.
That's great news.
Yeah, it's hard to say because, like I said, since I write out of order, and sometimes even when I think I'm finished, then when I go back to read it, I realize that there are scenes missing, or, you know, like I said, you think you're connecting the dots, and then you realize that there's whole areas that need to be written to connect maybe one scene to the next. So we will see what happens.
So we have some questions in chat.
All right.
Do you have a working name for your work in progress?
I do. It has a title. I have decided that I'm not going to share it just because I just feel like I'd rather wait to share it when I am finished and I do a cover reveal. I can tell you that it is not called To Conquer Prejudice. It does not have the word prejudice in it. The only hint I will give you is that it has a long word in it because my cover, like I didn't, you know, when a writer thinks of the title, these things don't occur to them, or like it didn't occur to me until my cover designer was like, that's a really long word and I'm gonna have trouble getting this on the cover. So that's my little hint, but yeah, I'm not gonna release the, like let the cat out of the bag with the title just yet.
So I don't know, would anyone like to ask Jennifer any other questions, or maybe there'll be something that we can answer.
I'll ask a question. Sorry,
Oh,
don't know if somebody else has popped in. Apart from them getting married early, how closely does it follow canon and some of the other events?
not at all, I would say. Yeah, definitely not at all. So we have them, you know, so where it opened, what I just read was the Netherfield Ball. So Darcy proposes the next day. They get married pretty quickly within a week or so. They go to Pemberley. So the beginning, it starts in Hertfordshire, but they go to Pemberley pretty early on. And then I'd say from then on, it's totally off canon. Yeah, especially because obviously in canon we don't, you know, they're not married. So yeah, so totally new story, I'd say. So I guess I'll give out just a few like little details to pique people's interest. So Darcy has a secret, which Elizabeth will discover upon, you know, moving into Pemberley. Lydia does play a role in the book, but I have kind of redeemed her. I hope so. She will sort of she won't be quite the Lydia we know from canon. I think I've redeemed her a little bit. And another fun fact is that there's a dog. So yeah, so there will be, Darcy has a dog that kind of plays a part in the book as well.
Well, it's lovely to hear about all the little things we have to look forward to. And it was lovely to see you, Lucy. It's great that you've joined us, and hopefully we can do many more events like these together. And actually, I was quite fascinated by what you were saying earlier. The what matters in Jane Austen. There was a certain idea in that book that I don't know may tie in or not with Jennifer's early marriage scenario. I was absolutely staggered when he pointed out that when John Mullen pointed out that the only couple in all of Jane Austen who address each other by their Christian names are those who don't respect each other. The Musgroves in Persuasion, and I don't know. This is one of the points where our modern brains just completely flummox us, because I just can't imagine a scenario where they spend their married lives with Elizabeth calling him Mr. Darcy, even when they are deeply and madly in love, or even Darcy.
It's funny that you mentioned that, because that is actually a sort of a plot point in the book, is that Elizabeth does not call him, she calls him Mr. Darcy after they get married, and he calls her Elizabeth. And it really frustrates him that she won't call him by his given name, and he kind of calls her out on it. And, you know, her response is that her parents don't do that, and she, you know, but the real reason is that she just doesn't feel attached to him in that way. And, you know, she doesn't, you know, so not to like spoiler alert, but you know, as she kind of softens at the end, you know, she addresses him as his, you know, by his given name, you know, when things when they sort of fall for each other. So it looks like, so there's a couple questions. So does Wickham cause trouble in this one or a different villain? Wickham causes trouble in this one. So yes, same villain. Again, it plays out differently than in canon, but the villain is the same. And then do you have rules you follow in writing? Hang on, I gotta go back. Do you have rules you follow in writing? Example, there's always a happily ever after for Darcy and Elizabeth. I mean, I think we can all pretty much answer. Like, I think that the readers would probably string us up if there wasn't a happily ever after for Darcy and Elizabeth. Personally, yes, there will always be a happily ever after for Darcy and Elizabeth in my books. And Joanna, I assume you are the same.
Oh, absolutely. It's well, of course, there is the theory of whether or not the story is happy. It depends on where you put the end. At some point, I was toying with the idea of writing a sequel to The Unthinkable Triangle, which
yes.
well, you say that, but for some reason, this is I think one of my books that's the most scary, and I don't know why. I really don't know why, because it's sort of been done before, and I'm thinking, well, hang on a minute, they spend all their time together. What's the problem? But well, anyway, they did get their happily ever after there, and I was going to toy with the idea of the Colonel's return, but I was worried that I might actually be lynched in the public square if there's any suggestion that there's trouble in paradise, and not, goodness no, not in the sense that Elizabeth would consider herself in love with anyone but Darcy. But I was considering a scenario where the return of the first flame might make Darcy feel insecure and behave completely foolishly and shoot himself in the foot. And it's fun to imagine that.
I've been saying for years that you should write that. I've told you privately that The Unthinkable Triangle is probably my favorite of all your books, and it is really angsty. So I know that some people, you know, have trouble with that, and definitely have trouble with Elizabeth, you know, with Richard as a love interest, or I guess I should say Colonel Fitzwilliam, since we don't really necessarily know his first name, but yeah, or with anybody else as a love interest. But I love that book, so I would definitely be all over a sequel. So I say write that book. So in terms of rules, I don't really, other than, of course, there's always going to be a happily ever after for Darcy and Elizabeth. I don't know about any other rules. One thing that I would say, I have like, it's not a rule. I've just kind of noticed that it's something that I gravitate towards in my writing, and that is that all of my books have, and probably all will always have some kind of illness or injury in them. I really like to put my characters in those situations. And I think just because when there's an illness or an injury, people are sort of at their most vulnerable. And so I just love seeing that play out, and how, you know, you really have to let your guard down and have somebody else sort of take care of you. So I did it obviously in To Conquer Pride with a carriage accident, and also Georgiana. There's a major illness with Georgiana in that book, and then in this one, it's not quite as dramatic, but there is a little bit of an illness in this one as well.
And
so
I liked how you put it. I think when you were launching To Conquer Pride, you were talking about the illness as the great equalizer.
Joanna, a question from YouTube. Patty Edmondson would like to know about your sequel idea. If not a book, could you write a few scenes for Austen Variations?
That actually would, I do have a scene. Strangely enough, it's a bit of a backstory. Where I was writing Miss Darcy's Companion, and so I was trying to look through some pieces of classical music to see what would work best. And there is this tremendous aria, which I will not embarrass myself by trying to hum it at any cost. but the lyrics started something along the lines of I don't dare express how I feel, but if you look closely, my eyes would speak for me. And of course, that aria fitted the plot in Miss Darcy's companion, in the sense that if Darcy looked closely, he would have noticed that for once in that particular scenario, Elizabeth was the one who fell in love first. But just as I was in the middle of writing that, this scene popped up with in the music room at Pemberley during a very large gathering at Christmas, when they're all there, the Darcys, the Bingleys, Colonel Fitzwilliam and his Spanish wife, and they've invited this tremendous diva who happened to be in the area, and she came to sing for them. And as she sings, he realizes that, well, actually, he thought he was over her, but he's so not over her. So I don't know, goodness knows where I'll go from there, but I will endeavor not to be lynched. Speaking of which, Abigail, I can't wait to talking about scary bunnies, rotten tomatoes and everything thrown in our general direction. I can't wait to see what you're making with your next one. It's going to be, I can't wait till next weekend to your excerpt reading.
Same.
Well, thank you. And I see a question here asking about the breed and name of the dog in Jennifer's book, and I'll just throw in that I just have to tell you my book has a puppy in it, and his name is Sir Galahad, and he's a mutt. And Elizabeth names him Sir Galahad because she first finds him when she's extremely upset about Darcy, and holding the puppy makes her feel better. So
that's so sweet.
Because he rescued her.
That's,
sorry, just
there must be something in the air this year, because I was talking to Jennifer about, I don't know, a couple of months ago. One of the other things that are percolating in my head, another forced marriage scenario, and this time it is a forced marriage scenario. It is a compromise in the whole story. And Jennifer mentioned that she has a puppy in her story, and I was thinking, oh, hang on, I was going to. I was toying with the idea of her having a puppy and Darcy jealous of the affection that the puppy's getting when he's not having much success at the moment. And Sir Galahad is joining the story. So we're all gonna write about puppies. It's gonna be nice.
Yeah, it's so funny. It's like somebody was asking, like, you know, I know there are certain authors who don't, like Jaff authors who don't read other Jaff because they're afraid of, you know, being influenced or whatever. And I do, I love it. So I read away. But, you know, sometimes you'll see an idea and you'll be writing the same thing. And you're like, I swear I didn't take this because, so Joanna was kind of like, well, I don't want to do a dog because you did a dog. And I was like, there's room for like other, you know, you can have a dog too. It's fine.
I think a long time ago, when there was less Jaff in the genre, it was, I don't know, in some ways harder, because you'd think, oh, I've got this premise, I've got to write the book quickly. What if somebody else thinks about it? And now, when there's so many of us, there's every chance that someone else would have thought about it by now. And at that point, it doesn't matter anymore. So there's no stress. You just write your own story, write the story that you'd like to read, as you said.
Yeah. So, well, it's funny because, and I don't think I've ever like told Abigail this, but when I started writing To Conquer Pride in like 2015. I don't know when, Abigail, you published Alone with Mr. Darcy, but that came out probably after I'd already written a first draft, and I was like, oh, great, now we have this snowstorm scenario that I'm running. And Abigail Reynolds wrote it. I mean, no one's going to read mine. You know?
Hey, Jack Caldwell wrote a snow scenario. I think Maria Grace wrote
that was so good. I love that.
So I guess we're all, you know, we're all doing it. You know, I mean, obviously, I think, you know, our books are all different, but there's just something kind of great about that scenario. So of course we all like to use it as a jumping off point. But to answer the dog question, so the dog is a hunting type dog. And his name is actually kind of significant. So there's something special about the dog, which I won't give away, but maybe people can guess. So that his name is Harpocrates, which is the Greek god of silence. So maybe people can guess what's special about him based on his name.
And another question from YouTube for Joanna from Rita. Can you tell us something about what you're writing now?
I'm I really shouldn't be, because I've got to get the audiobook out. I need to get the paperback back out. But I've got two things that are pulling me in two different directions. One is that Rita Diodato by any chance?
Yes.
Right, it's the story that we were brainstorming at Pemberley when you and Glynis and I were there. So that's pulling me in one direction, and the compromise scenario is pulling me in a different direction. So goodness knows what's which one's gonna win.
So have you started either one? Have you started anything yet?
I have started on both, which is a very, very, very bad idea.
It's funny. I don't know if there are any more questions coming in now, but we did get a couple from Facebook before, so I can go to that. So Laura Rains asked us on Facebook, were there scenes you ended up cutting in any of your books that you wish you could have kept? I don't think I did cut anything. I tend to write pretty bare bones first drafts, so usually I'm adding when I'm revising and not cutting. I think there are a few scenes where I probably like condensed some scenes, like if I had a few conversations between Georgiana and Darcy, I might have condensed them into one scene, but I don't think I've ever, I mean, in my one book, I don't think I did cut anything. Joanna, have you cut stuff in any of your books?
An awful lot, but I don't think I missed it. I find it quite hard to cut, but when I do, it's gone.
Oh, that's so interesting, because I cut an enormous amount. My outtake files are at least 30,000 words, often 50,000
Well,
words.
you do that too.
Yes.
I used to just cut chunks out, and now I'm thinking, hang on a minute, what if I changed my mind and I want to take that bit? So I'm just copying and pasting them in another document, and that, as you said, is bigger than the origin, than the actual story.
No, my books would just meander all over the place if I didn't cut. So
yeah, and see, I tend to write really, like I said, bare bones, and I usually have to add because I just have like the most basic thing. And then another question, what aspects of your creative process do you enjoy the most, and which are the most challenging? So I would say for me, I love revising, and everything else is challenging. I don't really love drafting. So once I get something on the page and I can work with it, then I'm happy, but it's just the staring at a blank screen and kind of coming up with the words for the first time. I'm not, it's not my thing. I would much rather edit somebody else's writing than to come up with the writing myself. But, once I have something and I can start working with it, then I'm happy. Joanna, what about you?
But I was just thinking, that's so funny, because I'm exactly the opposite.
The opposite.
When it gets to the revising, I'm getting bored, and it's, oh goodness, it's the same words, the same thing. I've just gone through all this for the fourth time. I can't bear it. But I do absolutely love the I wonder what's going to happen next kind of stage. I start my day with a cup of coffee, usually on the back steps in the garden. And I'm looking at the scenery and thinking, right, so what would they do? What's reasonable and sensible for them to say to each other, and how would they react to a particular situation? So, and it's just marvelous not knowing what's going to happen and what they're going to surprise me with today. It's a brilliant feeling.
Yeah, I guess it depends. It depends on the day, or if sometimes you have something in your head, and then it's really exciting because you want to just get it out. But then there are other times which to me are come more often, where I'm just like, I don't know. I mean, and I think that's why I write out of order, because when when I get something in my head, I'll just almost have like dialogue playing out inside my head, or, you know, and I feel like if I don't write it now, I'll never remember it the way, you know, it is. So I just write, I just like jump in and write whatever, which is why I have a hot mess right now. But
it swings and roundabouts, because on one hand it's so much more difficult to get them to piece together when you're when they weren't written in sequence. But on the other hand, if something's burning to be written and you're trying to slog to get there, it's just so not serving any purpose, because it's just, oh, let me get on with this scene so that I can get to that bit that I really want to write.
well, I'll ask a question of you, Joanna, since, I mean, I'm just like a little baby writer, but you cranked out so many books. Do you have trouble thinking of new variation ideas? Like, you always hear about these authors who have like 100 plot bunnies. I mean, I've literally seen people post on Facebook, they have like 50 plot bunnies that are like, you know, waiting to be written. And I'm lucky if I can think of like one idea for the next book. So would you say it's easy? Like, do you have a lot of things that you're thinking?
I don't have loads of plot bunnies. I think they would absolutely terrify me. I do have, I don't know, 5 or 6 that are hopping madly in the corner. But no, I think I'd be absolutely terrified if I thought, oh my goodness, there's that and that and that, and I'm not going to live long enough to write them all.
Another question from YouTube. This is from Christina. Joanna and Jennifer, have you ever thought to write Jaff in another era?
Do you want to go first, Jennifer, or?
That's for both of you.
Yeah, I mean, for me, probably not. I am kind of stuck in the Regency. I never say never. Who knows? Maybe someday. But I really, something about the Regency period. I love the language, and I love just everything. You know, just sort of the strictures of the society and what, you know, what that means for the relationship. But never say never, I guess. Who knows? Joanna, what about you?
Yeah, well, as you said, never say never. I know that I do enjoy, there was some modern variations that completely blew my mind. I'm struggling a bit with the idea of letting go of Regency, because I need my props. It's you know, all the do's and don'ts and all the taboos, and I'm thinking, hang on, if they can actually talk to each other, and if they can ring each other up, and if they can sleep together, what on earth am I left to write about? But I think that's just me. But yeah, never say never.
So I see another question in the chat. Do either of you wake up in the middle of the night and have to write your thoughts down? I don't know about wake up in the middle of the night, but definitely sometimes like right before I fall asleep or first thing in the morning. I think there's something to do with like your creativity at that time, when you're sort of like, I don't know, your guard is down or something. I don't know. But yes, or not only then too, just like random times, like when I'm in the grocery store or something will just pop into my head. So honestly, I mean, I write things on notes on my phone constantly. Like if I have just a snippet of dialogue or something, I'll just type it quickly into the notes section of my phone. Otherwise I would forget it.
Yeah, I'm one step up from the quill. I'm not writing them on my phone, but I do walk around with my biro and loads and loads of bits of paper to keep scribbling ideas on. I can't say that I've been woken up by a plot idea yet, but when I was writing Mr. Bennet's Dutiful Daughter, I do remember sitting down, right, I'll just get this scene out and see how it plays out and how it might play out. And before I knew it, I sat down to write at about 11 p.m. and before I knew it, I looked out and it was already daylight. The whole night has just flown by, and I just couldn't let go till that was out. But I don't know. I think we're absolutely blessed to be able to spend our time doing this, and huge thanks to people who are reading what we're writing. The fact that you like to read what we like to write is just the best gift of all. So thank you.
Agreed. And I think that's a great way to wrap it up. And just to say that this has been so much fun. And I know Abigail and Maria Grace and everybody else kind of said it yesterday, but just to be able to kind of see the faces of our readers and get to interact and get to kind of, you know, hang out together has been really fun. And we have a couple more hours of fun stuff today. And I'll also just put in a plug that we're doing a watch party on our Facebook page, the Boston Variations Facebook page tomorrow, of Sense and Sensibility, right? Is that, yes, I believe that's tomorrow at 2 p.m. Eastern time, correct? I believe so. So we're all going to hang out, a bunch of us. Definitely Joanna and I will be there. So
get the popcorn.
yeah, get the popcorn, and we'll all watch together and comment and have fun. So on that note, I guess I'll turn it over to Maria Grace.